Hello, welcome back to Wednesday Word. I'm so excited to have you join me today because we are going to begin a brand new study. If you have been with me at all recently, you know that we have been talking about the patriarch Abraham. And I have thought numerous times it's almost impossible to study one patriarch because their lives overlap. So because of that reason, we're actually going to look at Isaac and Jacob somewhat mixed as we begin a brand new study. Now, in our discussion of Abraham, we talked about his importance, his view as father of the faith, the way he's revered by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. We've talked about the impact he's had on the religious world and the fact that he waited 25 years for the birth of a promised son so that the covenant promise that God had made him would be fulfilled. We know that he was about 100 years old and Sarah was about 90 when Isaac was born. So we see a lot of events occur before Isaac is born into that family. And once he's born, there are some, I would call them important events. They're in the life of Abraham, but they most definitely involve Isaac. We know that once he's born, the next time we see him is when his weaning is being celebrated, and that's in Genesis 21, especially verse 8. And Isaac was probably about 3 years old at that time. And we know that something happened. Something that Ishmael did or said that set Sarah off. She was just beyond coping with Ishmael, and she demanded at that point that Ishmael and Hagar be sent away. So the next time we see Isaac, Ishmael's gone. He's been sent from the family unit. We know that Abraham grieved that, but it happened because God told Abraham to go ahead and do it. So the next time we see Isaac, Abraham is an older man. Isaac is not a little boy. He's probably a teenager or maybe even a young adult. And God has asked Abraham to do a very difficult thing. He asked Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt offering to him. And we know that Abraham and Isaac and a young man journeyed until they were close to Mount Moriah. And there Abraham was prepared to sacrifice. Isaac already had the knife raised when God stopped him and a ram was provided. But we know that whole scene was a foreshadowing of the day that Jesus Christ would be offered as the ultimate sacrifice for our sin. And we even know that Mount Moriah later became what we know as Mount Zion, the location of the temple in Jerusalem. So we saw that there were some time gaps. We saw that Abraham mourned the loss of Sarah, that she was buried in the cave of Machpelah, and that before he was too old to play a role in that Abraham wanted to make certain that Isaac would not marry a Canaanite. And to that end, he dispatched his senior servant, the man who was actually over the affairs of his household, and that was probably Eliezer, because we had seen him mentioned at other times previously in that story. And so he asked this trusted servant to make a very strong oath to promise that he will return to Abraham's home of origin, to the country of Nahor, Abraham's brother, and find a wife for Isaac among Abraham's own family and relatives. And so not only did he ask for that promise, the servant had concerns. What if the young lady won't come back with me? And Abraham said, look, if she won't come back, you will be relieved of this oath, but don't under any circumstances take my son back there to live. He was to remain in the area that God had promised that Abraham's descendants would one day inhabit. So we know that this trusted servant goes back to the land of Nahor, Abraham's brother. He puts some very strong and specific criteria in place for the young woman who will be the one that God has picked to become the bride of Isaac. You remember, he says, now God, he's praying, now God, let the young woman who offers not only to give me drink, but offers to water all of my camels, let her be the one that you have picked to be the bride of my master's son Isaac. And we know that when Abraham sent him, his details were clear. When this servant prayed to God, his details were cleared. And in all of that, Rebekah met each portion of that criteria. And we know that even when her brother Laban and her mother wanted her to be able to stay and visit and have a prolonged time of saying goodbye, that she agreed to leave immediately and go and return to Isaac and to Abraham. So, not return, but go to Isaac and Abraham so that she could become Isaac's wife. So most definitely, details and criteria were met. At the end of that journey, Isaac was walking in a field in a time of contemplation. Some scholars think that perhaps he was still missing his mom. I wonder if he wasn't anticipating the arrival of his wife. She sees him. She inquires as to his identity. And when she is told that that is Isaac, the one who is to become your husband, the son of my master Abraham, she adjusts her veil, as would have been appropriate in her day, and alights from the camel and runs toward Isaac in anticipation and in deference to who he was. And we know that Isaac took her to his mother Sarah's tent. He married her immediately. She became a comfort to him. And as we left our study of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael got back together, and together they buried Abraham where Sarah had been buried and where we know that other patriarchs in this lineage would later be buried. So that ended the story of Abraham. Even though he had 6 other sons by Keturah, they were sent away. Ishmael was sent away. Everything Abraham basically had went to Isaac. Before he ever marries Rebekah, he is well established. When his father dies, he's a rich man. And so that takes us to Genesis 25 and to verse 19, and we will begin this new study right there. And I will read through verses 19 through 28. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Padanaram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his plea. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived, but the children struggled together within her. And she said, "If all is well, why am I like this?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red, and he was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so that he was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Oh my. Okay, now it's interesting to note, we are looking at Isaac's genealogy as we begin with verse 19 here. But did you notice that it didn't start with Terah, Abraham's father? It didn't go beyond him, moving backwards to Noah. It starts with Abraham. Now why? Because that is very unusual as genealogies go. I personally believe it's because the covenant promise started with Abraham. Even though biologically we can trace him back to Noah and behind Noah back to Adam, that is not done because the covenant promise started with Abraham. No mention of other relatives at all in verse 19. Now we know that Isaac was the promised son. He was the son of covenant. And God intended to keep his promise to Abraham through Isaac. So just as Sarah had been barren back when she was called Sarai, now we see that Isaac's wife, Rebekah, is barren. Sometimes I wonder if these women in this family had trouble conceiving because it needed to be totally clear that everything about this process was ordained of God and enabled by God. I mean, because he's working on a covenant people, and everything about it is part of his plan. So just as Sarai, who became Sarah, was barren, so Rebekah is barren. Now what do we know? What do we know about time frames? We know that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. I personally, though Scripture does not tell us, I believe that Rebekah would have been younger than him. Now why would I think that? Because she was described as a beautiful young virgin. And a virgin close to 40 years old would have been given in marriage a long time ago. So I believe that Isaac was 40, his wife Rebekah was younger, and when the twins are born, Isaac is 60. So Isaac and Rebekah waited 20 years for a child to be born to their marriage. That's a long time. Not as long as Abraham waited, but still a long time. There's one other thing that separates Isaac's birth. Isaac's 60. Abraham was 100. It is likely that Rebekah is significantly younger than Isaac, certainly unlike Sarah's 90 when Isaac was born. Nevertheless, the children born to them are just as much a part of God's plan as Isaac had been. So, all right, we see here that God has delayed, in their opinion, children being born. So we open this passage with this very brief genealogy and then move immediately to Isaac pleading with God for his wife to conceive and bear a child or children. And we know that God answered that prayer, that she did conceive. It would seem to me that Isaac was not just mourning the fact that he and his wife did not have children. It's got to be a fact that all his life Isaac heard Abraham speak of God's covenant promises, of how he was the child born miraculously to see that covenant promise of an heir kept. So I have to believe that to Isaac, he's carrying the weight of seeing that covenant promise continued and its fulfillment continued. So that would have had to bother him. There's no doubt about that. So afterwards, God answers Isaac's prayer, but it seems from the text that the pregnancy is difficult. Now we know that a multiple birth pregnancy is harder in some ways, and not knowing that it was a multiple birth until God spoke to her, Rebecca would have been very confused by what she felt. Instead of what would have felt like normal movement of a baby in utero, there would have been multiplied arms and legs moving around, and it felt like there was a war going on in her body. It's almost as if Jacob and Esau struggled even in the womb for dominance. Who would be the firstborn? Who would inherit most of Daddy's possessions? And Isaac was wealthy. He was a wealthy man just from what he got from Abraham, and God continued to bless him, so he was very wealthy. The conflict in utero not only was present, but would not stop when these babies were born. So because of her concern for the pregnancy, probably for her discomfort as well, Rebecca approaches the Lord with her questions. Now, we do not know what that means. We assume that it was prayer or something like that, but we're not provided any details about how that came to pass. But she inquired of God. I think probably we got very few details about what she did because the focus is on God's answer to her, as recorded in verse 23. And that answer includes an incredible amount of details for this woman to know about what the future holds. God says, look, no wonder you feel like you do. There are two nations struggling in your womb. Two totally different people groups. Now that probably would not make sense to her. Okay, I'm going to have twins, but the idea that those twins would not be in unity and would not stay together probably would not have crossed her mind. And God goes on and tells her, look, one of these people groups is going to be way stronger than the other. And the most telling detail that God provided was the fact that the older would serve the younger. The second born, even though there wouldn't be a big time gap, would serve the firstborn that might be 2 minutes or 10 minutes, however long, older than his younger brother. Now we know that this idea of two nations meant that Jacob would have descendants that would go one direction and Esau would have descendants that would go another direction. Jacob's descendants would be ultimately called the Israelites. Esau's descendants would ultimately be called the Edomites. Unfortunately, there was not only strife between Jacob and Esau, but much strife, overt conflict, continued and is recorded basically throughout Old Testament history. Listen to 2 Samuel 8:14. He also put garrisons in Edom, where the Edomites would be. Throughout all Edom, he put portions, and all the Edomites became David's servants. What? So David stationed people in their midst, and the Edomites paid tribute to and served David, and the Lord preserved David wherever he went. What about Psalm 137 and verse 7? Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. So the Edomites basically cursed Jerusalem, wanted her enemy to destroy her, and Babylon accommodated that. Numbers 20 verses 14 through 21 is another account. I won't read all of that. What about the book of Obadiah? It was a message, a prophetic message of God's coming judgment on Edom because they were prideful, because they mistreated those of Judah, especially during Jerusalem's downfall, which means that Obadiah relates to the same concept we find in Psalm 137:7, which I just read. Now we know that it was customary for a younger son to defer to be lesser than, almost subservient to the older son of the family. And if there were multiple sons, to the oldest son. The oldest son got a double portion of everything Daddy had. He inherited the role of head of the family in terms of leading the family in basic decisions, also in a spiritual sense. This concept of the older son inheriting the most and inheriting the responsibility is known as primogeniture. It's a very common old practice in ancient times, and we see it clearly defined in Scripture. Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17. If a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and they have borne him children, both the loved and the unloved, and if the firstborn son is of her who is the unloved, then it shall be on the day he bequeaths his possessions to his sons, that he must not bestow firstborn status on the son of the loved wife in preference to the son of the unloved, the true firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. Okay, so firstborn son, doesn't matter if your mama wasn't the favored wife, you are getting a double portion and you will be head of that family, both in family status and family matters and in spiritual matters. And in this case, there's one more thing. As the one through whom the covenant promise will be passed. Wow, that's even more weighty and powerful, and sets this particular birth order issue into a classification of its own, even apart from what was customary in that day. Now, we know that you can't put God in a box. He is not necessarily going to follow what we think is typical and what we think is right. He certainly doesn't bow to customs or social mores. His plan is his plan, and it includes his power to see his plan come to pass. Certainly his favor and his intention to keep his covenant promise is not going to fly out the window just because of some dynamics that are going to be in place. From the moment these twins were born, it's clear that something interesting is going on. Did you notice that Jacob was born holding on to Esau's heel? Can you say holding on by his coattails, some of the old-timers would say. Now, sometimes the name Jacob is associated with the idea of heel catcher, with the idea of supplanter, taking someone else's position, with the idea of deceiver. And from birth, he's illustrating those things. We also see immediately that these two babies who become men are different from the beginning. Esau, the firstborn, was ruddy and hairy. The concept of redness is associated with him. In fact, the name Esau means hairy or rough textured. We know he grew up to be an outdoorsman, a skillful hunter, no cooking soup and no household chores for him. He was the manly man type out in the wild, killing wild game. But we also know that he apparently did not have much value for spiritual things. He did not value the role of head of the family. Some things that should have been important to him were not, and that is an important concept to bear in mind. Jacob, the second-born, would grow up to be a mild man, the English versions often say. But that word mild in English is not a great translation of the Hebrew word here. It's a little bit, the English word's a little bit lacking there. The word mild suggests that he was stable and solid, not just mild-mannered, but talking about someone who's predictable and not volatile. Okay, so the differences are obvious. Jacob would hang around the tents. Esau would go out into the fields. Their priorities were different. Their personalities were different. Their appearances were different. They were different. Now, okay, if Isaac is 60 when they're born, they'd been married 20 years. These kids are born. They're going to raise them. Even though they're old enough to have some wisdom, they set in place what will become a dysfunctional family. And you're going, dysfunctional family? Well, I mean, what do you mean by that? I mean that even though Isaac loved Rebekah, we remember that they played favorites amongst their children, that Isaac preferred Esau, Rebekah preferred Jacob, and there was going to be some manipulation and deception involved trying to help God out. I'm just going to tell you that God does not need me to fix things for him. He needs me to be obedient. And I think you understand what I'm saying here. And in the next section, some things about the character of these two men are going to become more readily apparent. But not just the character of Esau and Jacob, but we're going to begin to see the character of these parents as well. I'm in Genesis 25, beginning my reading at verse 29, and I'll read through verse 34. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Notice that he did not say, "I have no food." He said, "I'm tired. I'm worn out." Therefore, his name was called Edom. Remember, the idea of redness is associated with him. But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." And Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" Then Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." So he swore to him, meaning Esau swore, and sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of bean stew. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils, which is beans, vegetables. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now there is a lot packed into that short statement. So where are we? These are men now. They may have been relatively young men, but they are not babies. These are not toddlers. They're not baby young teens. They're men who are able to do chores and to live out lives according to their personalities. Esau's back from hunting. He's worn out. Now, we don't know. He could have had game with him that he had killed. The word doesn't tell us. What it says is he's worn out and he's hungry. So he does not want to wait for something to eat. Now, Isaac is wealthy. He has lots of herds. Lots of people are with him. How do I know that? Because that was true for Abraham. I know it's true for Isaac now. Do you suppose there was no one in that entire encampment who would have given Esau anything to eat when he was the master's firstborn son? I don't believe that, not for 1 minute. So he asked Jacob, give me some of this bean stew you're fixing here that you're preparing. It's bubbling, it smells good, I want some. Okay. Jacob immediately demands that Esau sell him his birthright for this bowl of beans that he has requested. Now, here's what is not commonly taught. In the Hurrian custom, that means in the custom of the people who lived near Haran, a man was allowed to sell his birthright and all that birthright entailed to his brother if he chose to do that. Now, we can't deny that Jacob's demand is opportunistic. In fact, it's a little ruthless, certainly a whole lot selfish. Do you think there wasn't enough bean stew to spare a bowl for his brother? Do you think his brother wasn't entitled to it anyway? Of course he was. So Jacob demands this trade occur and expects his brother to pay an unthinkable price for bean stew. It also, I'm going to argue, though you don't always see scholars mention this, but I'm going to argue it demonstrates a lack of faith on Jacob's part. Why? Do you suppose Jacob doesn't know he's Rebekah's favorite? That he doesn't know that God told Rebekah that the older son would serve the younger? I don't know about that. If he does know, do you think he can't trust God to bring that to pass? Do you think he's got to manipulate to get it for himself or to get what he thinks will procure it for himself? But on the flip side of that, Esau appears to have little value, which, we can't conclude anything else, that he values his birthright so little that he will trade it for a bowl of beans, in essence. Does he not understand that he's making a life-altering decision in a short amount of time that might not be reversible? Does he not understand the spiritual significance, not just the wealth that's included? Does he have no foresight? Is he not concerned with God's plan and where God might have been, and does he know the prophecy? I don't know. But he bargained away the most valuable thing he could ever hope to possess with what appears to be little thought and not a whole lot of remorse. He actually put himself in a position to be defrauded by the cunning supplanter who's cooking the bean stew. Jacob's determined to have that birthright, and Esau is not determined to hold on to it. He's not even willing to see how God will work things out for him. Now, there's a major problem here. Esau was born first, but obviously God saw this part of Esau's character, that he did not have an appreciation for spiritual things and spiritual matters, that he would not be a good choice to live out the covenant that had been made to Abraham. He is not the candidate, which is why God told Rebekah what she did. But then I go back to this idea, okay, Esau's not the right one, God knows that, but could God not have handled the process of working out the details himself? And does no one trust God in this situation? So, there you have it. Esau he's not a drama queen, but he's a drama king. What does he tell Jacob? I'm about to die. What good is my birthright if I'm dead? I'm going to starve to death right here before you. And nobody ever starved in one day. It doesn't happen. So he's basically saying, I don't want the discomfort of being hungry. I'll trade you my birthright. He's exaggerating. He's not about to die. Esau is more concerned with the here and now and immediate creature comforts than he is the there and then and the fulfillment of God's purpose and what it would mean to have been the lineage to carry on that purpose. Wow. Jacob says, swear to me right now that this is going to be true, that I've bought your birthright, and that it starts today. Okay. I'll tell you the truth. If you look at their characters, Esau is certainly lacking, and Jacob is not ready to be the man to carry on the promises of God. He's ambitious. He's scheming. He's got a long way to go before he is the father of the people that will be those that are fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, and who will be those who are to worship God wholeheartedly. So God had some training to do of this prospective leader, this person that would step into the shoes that Isaac would ultimately vacate. We know that Esau ultimately made his home in the rocky hills of Edom. We know that his descendants exhibited the same disdain for spiritual values that Esau did, including a disregard for the agenda of Jehovah and his full intention to bless his chosen people Israel, and there was jealousy and resentment there throughout recorded history in the Old Testament. Wow. You know what? Poor decisions, ill-advised decisions that are made outside the will of God and with no regard for God's will and His purposes are always going to have a high price tag attached, and that one certainly did. Okay, back to our text. This time to Genesis chapter 26, verses 1 through 5. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's going to feel like deja vu. There was a famine in the land. besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands. And I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and to your seed all the nations of the earth and through your seed." No, I'll still get it right. "And in your seed." I knew I had missed a word, and I should have been looking at that word to fix it. "And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Okay, I told you it feels like deja vu. There is another famine. There's a famine in the land, and Isaac's got to do something. Now, we know that there was a famine in the land in the time of Abraham. This passage tells us, and that Abraham went down to Egypt. We find our first information about this famine in Genesis 12, and there is a later time when Abraham makes a moral mistake, an ethical mistake. It's recorded in verse 20. So Abraham heads south toward Egypt, and before he gets there, he asks Sarai, that was her name at that time, to do him a favor, a service for him that will help to protect him, because she's so beautiful, his life might be in danger. So he asks her to tell everyone she's his sister. And you know, they get to Egypt. Someone tells Pharaoh about Sarai, and sure enough, he grabs her and plunks her into his harem. Now, when this process occurs, God plagues the household of Pharaoh. And when he finds out what's going on, he's no little bit upset and wants to know why Abraham has done this. And he tells him, "Because I was afraid. I was afraid for my own skin. I thought someone would kill me so that person could take Sarai as his own wife or his own concubine." And so Pharaoh's unhappy and upset. He says, "You look what you've done to us." And he is, though he's generous with Abraham, he says, "Look, you take your wife and all your stuff and you relocate." And we know that later in chapter 20, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, that Abraham journeyed south to the territory of the Philistines, and he wanted Sarah to tell the same lie about her true relationship with Abraham. And this time she is plunked into the harem of Abimelech, king of Gerar. But this time Abimelech is warned in a dream. This man's a prophet. He'll pray for you, but don't touch his wife. Now, in both cases, neither man had gone near Sarai. She was protected. But now she's Sarah, and this man's been warned in a dream, and he's certainly not happy. And he says, "Look, you could have brought great harm to us. Look what you've done. What have we ever done to you to cause you to do that to us?" For whatever reason, Abraham impressed Abimelech, and Abraham's God impressed Abimelech. And we know that Abraham moved in that vicinity and in that area for a while. And we know that Gerar was a small settlement on the road to Egypt, about 11 miles south of Gaza. We get the impression here that Isaac intended to go on to Egypt. Notice, God says, don't go to Egypt. Well, it's logical that that was Isaac's intention, and God is stopping him. He wants him to stay in the land that has been promised to the descendants of Abraham in that proximity. We know all that land is controlled by someone else. Remember, Abraham owns a field and a cave where Sarah was buried and Abraham was buried. And Isaac is like Abraham. He's a sojourner. He stays a while one place and he moves somewhere else looking for pasture land for all those flocks that he has. So, okay, about this time, God affirms his oath sworn to Abraham. He promised to make Isaac's offspring as plentiful as the stars in the heaven. He repeated all aspects of the covenant, and he adds that there will be blessings and that Isaac's going to need to walk in obedience to receive those blessings. And we're about to see those things begin to develop, as well as the results of the fact that Isaac followed his father's footsteps in that misrepresentation of the true relationship of his wife. I'm in Genesis 26, verses 6 through 16. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, "She is my sister." Now, truthfully, okay, Abraham's brother is Rebekah's grandpa. Rebekah's father is Abraham's nephew. So they're something like second or third cousins. She is not his sister. Okay? He was afraid, our text says, to say, "She is my wife," because he thought, "Lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold." Now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out through the window and saw, and there was Isaac, showing endearment to Rebekah, his wife. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Quite obviously she is your wife. So how could you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I said, lest I die on account of her." And Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might soon have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us." So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Then Isaac sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous, for he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants. So the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, and they had filled them with earth. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." Okay, so Isaac lives out the deceptive pattern established by his father. Now, I've said many times, generational curses are mistaught. God doesn't sit up in heaven in this dispensation of grace and say, "I'm going to punish you because your father was a mess. He was terrible, so you're going to pay." That's not true at all, not even close to true. But learned behavior is powerful. I wonder if Isaac knew the stories about Abraham and the couple of times that he had resorted to this same method. I don't know that. Here's what I do know. Apparently, Isaac and Abraham had a similar concern that was a result of a mixture of fear and faith. And remember, fear and faith won't coincide. They won't reside mutually. One will overpower the other. So here we see that Isaac tells a lie in order to protect himself, he thinks, from someone who would want Rebekah enough to have him killed. We see fear certainly involved here, not just faith. It sounds exactly like what Abraham did. That's Genesis 12, verses 11 through 13. And it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt, this is Abram, that he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." Did you notice when I was reading the text here about Isaac that it said he'd been in the area a long time? That's an interesting fact. He's been around in that general vicinity a long time. So he has lived a lie for a long time, needlessly from all indications. His fear drove him to error that may have been totally unnecessary even from a human standpoint. He should have trusted God first and foremost. Secondly, there is no indication that Abimelech or any other man had even come close to approaching Rebekah, though that's certainly a very real possibility that Abimelech acknowledges. Now, King Abimelech is looking out of his window one day, and he sees Isaac and Rebekah playing around. They're having a good time. And he decides that the affection that Isaac shows is not the kind you would show toward his sister, and I don't know what that means. And so he calls Isaac in and confronts him, and he's indignant. "What are you thinking? What were you thinking? We're your neighbors. We let you live in the middle of us." And he basically rebukes Isaac for the deception that he's now figured out has occurred. He says, "You could have brought horrible guilt on our people if someone had crossed a line with Rebekah." He was so, I guess, impacted that he issued a very strong warning that anyone who touched Isaac or Rebekah would be killed. Now, I can't help myself. I can't avoid stopping here to say that Abraham used this same deception not once but twice. We're establishing a generational curse of deception here. And I promise you, what goes around comes around. And we will certainly see that. We know that Isaac planted crops in the land and that God blessed them, that those crops produced 100-fold. He prospered and prospered and prospered some more. He was already wealthy even before then. He had flocks, possessions, and many servants. Now, we know that in the Old Testament, wealth was considered to be a sign of divine favor, that it was like God was pouring out blessings on you, that it was considered to be a blessing for faithfulness. Obviously, both of those things are true. In sharp contrast, though, I have to acknowledge this, that in the New Testament, wealth is described as a hindrance to spiritual well-being and to total commitment, total dependency on God, total faithfulness without wavering. Wealth is seen as a hindrance to that. Why? Because the argument is that wealthy people will believe that their wealth can get them out of anything, where people who are a little more destitute have to fully trust in God. Okay, well, there's not an indication that wealth is bad. There's just an indication that it might be a bit of a hindrance to total dependency on God. Either way, it doesn't change the fact that Isaac is very wealthy. It's perceived as a blessing from God, and the Philistines are jealous of him. And unfortunately, it's sadly true that behavior that has its root in or its foundation on jealousy is not going to be good behavior. It's never going to be pretty when people are acting out of jealousy. So Abraham had sojourned in that area. We know that. He had dealt with a man named Abimelech. We know that. And with Abimelech's servant. But here it goes again. He had dug wells. We know that. But that's a problem again. I probably should say in passing that it's unlikely that the Abimelech that Abraham dealt with is the same Abimelech that Isaac dealt with. Because remember that Isaac was 60 when they were born, when the twins were born, and he was 40 before he even got married, and Abraham was living life, and there was Sarah, his wife. A lot of time's passed. I'm hesitating to try to convince you that a great deal of time has passed. So it's incredibly likely that this is kind of a family name, that it's a dynasty name that these kings of the Philistines have passed down. So it would be kind of like King Henry III or Abimelech the first or second or third. You see what I'm saying? That it was a name commonly used in the Philistine dynasties of leadership. So for whatever reason, the Philistines are jealous. Jealous behavior is never good, so they stop up, some of the shepherds do, wells that had been dug by Abraham. He dug them. They should have been functional. Isaac should have had access to them because they were dug and probably maintained by his father. And these wells have been filled with dirt, which means you have to dig them out. Now, we know that Abimelech had insisted that Isaac leave the area because he was stronger than the Philistines that lived in that area. We know that wells are going to become a problem, and that's exactly what we see when we go into the next section of Genesis 26. And I will do that when we come back together next time, and I do hope that you will join me as we continue our study of Isaac and Jacob. But before I say farewell for this time of our studying together, I just want to remind you that we are responsible for the example that we lead and that we leave behind us. We're example for the life that we conduct ourselves in. We're example for how we behave in front of people who are heathen. And though Abraham was a great man of faith and God revered and honored him as the father of faith and made a covenant relationship with him, twice In Genesis 12 and 20, Abraham failed, and then Isaac came right on behind him and did the same thing. We're going to see God bless Isaac, most certainly, but I would encourage us to be honorable and right before God, to keep His laws, and to work in a way before men that we set the right example. Until I see you next time and we come back and take up the life of Isaac again, as well as those stopped up wells, may you walk in truth and in faith, in humble obedience to our God, honoring Him as people watch our lives. God bless.